Well, good day to you, wherever you find yourselves. My name is Raj Patel, and I'm a writer, a filmmaker, an academic here at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm a panel member here at the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems. And I'm delighted that so many journalists covering the food crisis from around the world have been able to join us today. So the aim of today's session is to unpack the critical factors stoking the flames of global hunger. And our briefing today is happening in advance of the G7 summit in Germany, where world leaders are meeting and clashing over how to respond to this crisis. The event today is organized by IPES Food and A Growing Culture, and we're joined by an esteemed panel of leading figures and writers on the global food system. We're joined by Sofía Monsalve Suarez, based in Germany. She's the Secretary General of FIAN International and an IPES Food panel member. Ricardo Salvador is based in the United States and Director of the Food and Environment Program at the Unit of Concerned Scientists, also an IPES Food panel member. Mamadou Goïta is based in Mali, and he's the Director of the Institut de Recherche et de Promotion des Alternatives en Développement Afrique, the Institute for Research and Promotion of Alternatives in Development Africa. And he's also an IPES Food panel member. Finally, we're joined by Lei Win, who's based in Rome, and she's an investigative journalist at Lighthouse Reports. Now, just a few notes before we jump in. Please do update your screen name to reflect your publication, or please add freelance journalist or contributor with your affiliated publication. Please ensure your mic is on mute during the discussion. We are providing live interpretation in Spanish and French. You can select your preferred language by clicking on the globe icon under interpretation. I believe there's a slide to help us pass what I'm saying. But if you're on a mobile, please click on the three dots to find the interpretation options. This session is being recorded. Everything here is on the record. And the organizers will email a link to the recording to everyone who registered. Right. Well, let's start briefly by setting the scene. I'm going to do a sort of 7-minute blitz on what's happening in the global food system. And then we'll have some targeted questions to each of our panelists, and I'll moderate that. But during the panel discussion, we invite you to submit your questions into the chat. We'll incorporate as many of those questions as we can into the dialogue. And then we will have a formal Q&A section after about 45 minutes to jump in, and we'll have a hard stop in about 85 minutes from now. So with those formalities underway, I'm wondering if the good folk at A Growing Culture might let me share my screen so that I can just give you a background view on the crisis right now. Now, you will have seen headlines such as this, and the story of Ukraine and the conflict in Ukraine is often told as a story of how the global wheat market has been roiled by this conflict. But not just the market in wheat, but in sunflower oil, in fossil fuels, in fertilizer. And all of this is driving up food prices to unprecedented levels. You can see now on your screen a view of the Food and Agriculture Organization's Food Price Index. And you can see that in real and in nominal terms, it is skyrocketing. So perhaps one way, though, of understanding the crisis and the food crisis at the moment is first to recognize that this is a price crisis. This is not a crisis of production necessarily. If you look at the long view of how much food is being produced per person in the world today, you can see that there is, that we're at very historically fairly high levels of per person calorie and food production. And again, one way of thinking about the situation we're in is to imagine, well, what if the conflict in Ukraine ended tomorrow? What would happen? What would be driving then the global food crisis? Would there even be a global food crisis? Sadly, there would be, and there would be such a crisis because conflict remains. It raged before the conflict in Ukraine, and sadly, it seems to be set to range after. If you look around the world at the places that are going the hungriest, you'll see that there's a fairly high coincidence, as you can see in this map and the data from the World Food Programme, of places that are in high levels of conflict, of war, of civil disturbance, and acute levels of hunger. even if the conflicts around the world ended, we would still be in a situation where our dependence on chemicals also posed a severe problem. Right now, we're seeing farmers reluctant to respond to the food price crisis because it's very expensive for them to use the chemistry that they're wedded to under industrial agriculture. The Russian Federation is a large exporter of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium fertilizer, and that is already making things very difficult in the medium to long term. Our dependence on these chemicals for industrial agriculture is a problem that wouldn't go away even if the conflict in Ukraine were to end. Another feature, and although it's not fashionable to mention this, COVID is still around, and COVID is driving hunger. If you want, in a single sort of picture, the situation around global hunger, this data from the Food and Agriculture Organization kind of does it. You'll see that the lowest that we've had in terms of levels of hunger were around, in 2014, around 600 million people were undernourished for that year. That number has been going up ever since. And it's been made much worse by COVID and the recessions and the economic turmoil that's been associated with that. And so even before this conflict, even before the year began, we were in a situation where up to 811 million people would be undernourished, and the projection is that the conflict is possibly making it worse for another 100 million people. And again, even if the conflict weren't there, we would still be in a climate crisis. You'll remember earlier on this year that there was a catastrophic heat wave through the wheat growing areas of India and throughout Asia. Right now, there are catastrophic floods in those areas. And all of this has exacerbated the problems of the world food system. But you'll notice that we've been using the letter C as our guide here, from chemicals, conflict, COVID, and climate. And of course, the big C to talk about is capitalism. You'll notice that even though we're at a level where food production is generally fairly high, and the USDA is projecting not quite record levels of food production, but fairly high for this year as well, the wheat price has gone through the roof. And the traders who make money off this are doing quite well. You'll notice here the share price of Bunge and Archer Daniels Midland. Dreyfus and Cargill are private companies, but you'll notice they're outperforming the market. And whenever something fairly grim happens to wheat shipping facilities in Ukraine, you'll notice that their share price spikes. So all of this is to say that we are in a very complex emergency. This is not a simple story of, oh my goodness, there's just not enough food to go around. There are plenty of calories being pulled from the earth this year. The food crisis is a crisis of affordability, a crisis of poverty, a crisis of debt. And we're going to be exploring that now. And in fact, my first question today is to Tin, to really dig into this. So Tin, commentators frequently confuse the availability and the supply of food with access to food. In the reporting that you've seen, how is data used to portray misleading narratives around our global food economy? And if you can share a specific example in around 2 minutes, we'd be grateful.
Great. Thanks so much, Raj. I just want to actually first reiterate, the point that you made around availability versus access and affordability, because I think it is a really important distinction. Because when people see news headlines saying food shortages, they think that means we don't have enough food. That is not true, right? You yourself have shown just now with a graph that, crop yields have been increasing since the 1960s, yet we have 1 in 10 people who went to bed hungry in 2020. So why is that? It's because people cannot afford the food, or that they cannot get access to it. Perhaps because there are conflicts going on in their area, or they're just not, no market selling fresh food. What this shows is that hunger is a result of political decisions, not supply, right? For example, this could be due to a lack of investment in infrastructure, or a lack of social safety nets, or just government policy that makes it difficult for people to access affordable food. Just take Myanmar, for example, that's where I come from. we're a poor country, but we are a food surplus country, which means we grow more food than we consume. And yet there are minority groups who are going hungry, like the Rohingya. That's because of government policies that severely restrict their movement and their livelihood. So I think we really need to question what really is causing this hunger and food insecurity. Now, to give two brief examples about the data, you asked about, how data could mislead or cause misleading narratives. First, we talk about export figures, right? We have heard so much about how Russia and Ukraine account for a third of global wheat supply. But that is only part of the picture, because last year we produced almost 780 million tons of wheat. Out of that, only less than 25% actually were exported. So when we talk about global supply, right, Russia and Ukraine account for a third of almost 25% of wheat production. That is a very different statistics, right? Most of the food that we produce is actually consumed locally. And I think it is really important for journalists to know that context. The second example is also this, we've again, talking about the Ukraine crisis, we've heard about how these 20 odd million tons of grains stuck in Ukrainian silos, and how that could make the difference between hunger and people having enough food. But do we even know if those grains are all suitable for human consumption? And do we know that if those grains, if they are able to come out of Ukraine, that poor import dependent countries can actually buy them? Can they actually afford that grain? So I'm not downplaying the severity of what's happening or the repercussions around it, but I think it will serve as well to really ask questions behind these numbers and really understand where they're coming from.
Thank you so much, Tin. That was those two examples were very, very clear and very helpful. And when we can actually follow up on that straight with Mamadou, because Tin, you mentioned countries being able to import this food. Mamadou, I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of how the current food crisis is playing out in West Africa, but perhaps set the context for us. And why is it that countries in West Africa are so dependent on the imports that Tin was talking about, and so exposed to high food import prices?
Thank you very much. I think that there is a big problem with some statistics. If you look at the configuration of the food production systems in different countries, and in many of these West African countries, the most consumed cereal is millet or sorghum. But usually at any time there is a crisis on even maize or rice or wheat, it's impacting the market. It's a very artificial thing. For dependency is on some very few products. But if you look at the food reserve that some of these countries have, because the statistics that you are giving are not about what we call the first level of defense, because there are 3 levels of defense, that the one that is not assessed very clearly is the local level. This is what we call the farmer stock of cereals in these countries. So if beside that, most of the West African countries are mainly self-sufficient in food production, in millet, sorghum, and maize sometimes, but they are depending on some of the new products that have been coming in their food system, that is wheat with bread in the cities, or rice that is in countries like Senegal or so. So we don't have a clear assessment of what is actually in the first level of defense, that is in the farmer stock. The second level of defense is known, but the kind of solidarity that should exist, what we call a national stock of products, cereals in these countries. And there is a third level, that is at ECOWAS level, when we have food reserve at regional level. I'll come back on that. But actually, there is no clear picture of that. But artificially, some of the prices are up. It's very expensive to get access to maize, to millet and sorghum actually, but it shouldn't be, because there is a clear picture of how some countries have enough today to put on the market. But if you look at the territorial market, that is where the biggest share of the food is consumed, these markets are still working, and the prices are relatively at a level when we cannot talk about crisis yet in the region. So statistics that are sent behind this region are very alarming. in the sense, but if you look at the clear picture on the ground, and you will see that there is no alarming situation, and then you should just disconnect this territorial market and a local food system with a global one, where we have wheat as a problem and even fertilizer as a problem, but it shouldn't be in our countries because we are not too depending in our staple crops production on this kind of products.
Thank you so much, Mamadou. I mean, that's a perspective that's often overlooked and underreported. And I wonder if I can turn with that insight to Sofía. I mean, we've not really heard a great deal about effective anti-hunger programs. And I'm wondering if you can share from your work with FIAN what the response to this crisis has been, what effective anti-hunger programs look like, and why they're so often ignored.
Yes, thank you, Raj, and good day to all of you. Yes, I think that the main feature of effective anti-hunger programs is democracy, is really active participation of grassroots organizations and the groups most affected by hunger and food insecurity. So I will give you a concrete example, and it is the Fome Zero program in Brazil. It actually more than halved the percentage of the population suffering from hunger and severe food insecurity between 2004 and 2013. So it removed Brazil from the FAO hunger map. So what was the recipe of this success? I think first of all, the recognition that food is a right and that people have agency to organize themselves and decide what food policies they want. So I want to highlight three aspects of this approach that was put in place in Brazil. Well, first, they set up a National Council for Food and Nutrition Security, which had councils also at state level and municipal level. So these councils were fundamental for democratic deliberation around food. Second, three programs gave a considerable boost to peasant farming and agroecological food production. Here is the program for strengthening family farming, the national program for school feeding, and the program for acquiring food. These public policies were not designed to serve global supply chain and distant markets, but they were there to build territorial food systems, which connect, for instance, farmer cooperatives with school canteens so that children can enjoy healthy and fresh food. The third element was strengthening labor protection and social security systems. This is very significant because, as you know, we live all in market economies. So we can only have access to food if we can pay for it. If not, we go hungry. So if access to food is an entitlement, a human right, then your government must ensure that you earn a living wage, that you are covered by a social security system when you get sick and cannot work, or when you lose your job, or when you go on maternity leave, on when you retire. Problem is that neoliberalism and austerity policies have enormously weakened workers' rights and public social security systems around the world. So governments generally only care about keeping markets going. And if people don't have money to buy food, the offered solution, which is also gaining traction during this crisis, is to rely on corporate charity and their food banks instead of structural reforms of the economy. Unfortunately, the Bolsonaro government destroyed the existing anti-hunger policies in Brazil, so that Brazil returned to the hunger map of FAO. Today, 33 million Brazilians go hungry, which is about 15% of the population.
Thank you, Sofía, for first of all pointing out that there are alternatives to the quagmire that we're in, but also ending on that rather dark note of recognizing that neoliberalism is ascendant and that there are people who would prefer to make money off the situation rather than feed people. And that may sound like just sort of a rhetoric, but I actually wonder, Ricardo, if you might be able to fill that in. Speculation is, since this is a price crisis, food speculation is a major factor in food prices that isn't often reported. I'm wondering if you can fill in this idea that actually there is money to be made out of hunger, and particularly explain for those who may not have thought about it or reported on it, how to understand the role of speculation in the price determination for commodities.
Yeah, Raj, I can try to answer that question. Probably the easiest way to think about this is to realize that the majority of the ingredients for the processed food system that those of us in the wealthy part of the world are accustomed to is basically an undifferentiated product that is referred to as a commodity. It can be produced in various parts of the world and is fungible, has very low intrinsic price in the cash economy, and is a very small proportion of most processed food. So in this case, we're all mostly concerned about wheat, so we can focus upon it. In its least processed form, the way that most of us would see it would be as ground wheat, typically bleached, often fortified to compensate for the nutrients that are taken out during the processing to produce that white bleached ground wheat. And that's in its least processed form. We're most likely to see it as pastas, as Ritz crackers, and so on. The majority of the value in those products from the standpoint of the industry is in persuading you that that's what you want to buy, their marketing. And then secondly, there's transportation. And thirdly, there is all the packaging that is involved. The actual proportion of the total cost that is represented by the commodity input tends to be trivial. So a very vivid example of that would be a cereal box, based on wheat. Typically, the value of the wheat there would only be about 5% or less. The rest is the marketing, promotion, transportation, and packaging. So when you think of the fact that the agricultural product is just one component of assembling the food product, you see it as a commodity through the eyes of food manufacturers. And so understanding that, you know that the industry does its best to try to buy at large scale, reduce costs. And the pressure to find low cost leads to speculation because you are planning forward. You're making purchases that are scheduled. It's not unusual, a year in advance for the agricultural commodities that are required to manufacture these processed foods. And so therefore you're placing bets when you decide that you're going to pay on a contract that is a year in advance. The bet is this part of the world is going to have favorable environmental conditions, and therefore there's going to be ample supply, and therefore the price that I'm paying right now is a fair price. You may anticipate that actually there will be poor growing conditions because weather forecasts tell us that there may be drought, as is the case right now in two of the major wheat producing basins in Argentina and the Western United States. So you may try to lock in a low price for that right now, betting that prices will increase in the future. Everybody is in on the speculation game. Farmers themselves who are trying to sell their product at highest price, of course. But the major speculators are the large aggregators and brokers of grain, some of the companies that Raj has already mentioned, for instance, Dreyfus. So that's an important part to understand. And I will repeat, this is not seen as food by the majority of the people that are trading in this material. These are seen as commodities that are about one ingredient in the processed food economy that is global.
Well, and in fact, that prompts me to remember that Lei Win and her team did some brilliant investigative journalism on precisely this area, Ricardo. And in the Hunger Profiteers report, you covered the impact of commodity speculation, precisely understanding food as something, a vehicle for making money rather than something that actually feeds people. And Tin, I'm wondering if you can share with the journalists who are with us today how the sort of threshold for evidence that was required for you to do this reporting, and maybe just give us share some wisdom and some guidance on approaches of how journalists can start grappling with this sometimes very complex topic.
Thanks, Raj. So I'm going to sort of explain how we try to do this. And you are right, it is a complex topic, very technical. And I think sometimes that's to the benefit of people who want to profit of this, right? Because it makes it difficult for ordinary people to understand. It's too complex. unpacks. But it's not. It is hard, but it's not impossible. And we looked at excessive speculation. So this is, speculation beyond the normal market fundamentals of demand and supply, and whether they might be contributing to the food price crisis that we're seeing. And what we did was actually, like what all journalists spoke to former regulators, academics, experts, researchers, industry, insiders, to understand how the system worked. And then we tried to come up with a methodology, collect data from various public and private sources. And then we went back to the experts and asked them, these are our findings. Is that the right methodology? Can you interpret what this data is showing? What we also did was to request freedom of information requests as well, to establish, if the industry had lobbied to water down some of the stricter regulations that were being proposed after the 2007-2008 crisis. There is public data available, and the best places are the two regulators. That's the CFTC in the United States and ESMA in Europe. They actually provide information on levels of speculation. But if you want to dig deeper, then you need to find more private data, and like I said, FOIA requests and others to get information on exchange traded funds. The biggest issue, and you ask about the threshold of evidence, is extremely tricky because there is no consensus as to whether excessive speculation played a role even in a 2007-2008 crisis, right? And I want to emphasize that we weren't making any judgments. What we did was to go to experts and ask them to respond to our findings. But generally, the financial industry, makes much of this whole idea of a lack of consensus to resist any attempts to regulate the markets, right? And they said, there's no scientific consensus, and therefore we do not need any strict regulation. But these arguments are, largely about statistical measures of causation, very academic. But like Ricardo said, and like you said, we're talking about food here, right? This is the very basis of our existence. It should not just be seen as an ingredient of, just a single commodity. So we should be applying the precautionary principle and flip the burden of proof, which means that essentially, instead of us journalists having to prove that there is excessive speculation happening, the industry should be proving that there is no excessive speculation taking place. And I think journalists really need to be pushing and asking as to why food is, not being taken as it should be, which is the very basis of our existence.
Thank you, Tin. And the report for our participants here, the report that Tin produced with her colleagues is listed in the chat. And do, by the way, please use the chat to share your questions with us. We've got another 15 minutes where I'm asking the questions, and then I'm going to hand over the reins to y'all. And I'm very much looking forward to the questions that you have about the unreported parts of this food crisis. And maybe we should start there with actually zooming way out, sticking with the sort of financial idea, but recognizing that we are in a period of high inflation and therefore high interest rates. Now that's worth observing, because this is, as I mentioned at the beginning, a problem of poverty and of debt. And Sofía, you've been thinking about this and have been studying this. Many of the countries affected by the current crisis are also heavily indebted countries. Now, can you break down for us the relationship between the indebtedness of a country and its capacity to be able to respond to the food crisis, particularly in a time where the policy of the moment seems to be to raise interest rates and raise them yet further in the name of combating inflation? Can you help this is a fairly sort of obfuscated idea, but explain to us how interest rates, debt, and inflation matter for a country trying to fight the food crisis?
Yes, Raj. Well, we know, we have heard food prices are a record high, and the least developed food importers are paying more for less food. So the same trend is observed for the bill for imported agricultural inputs, 50% increase from 2020 to 22 for energy and fertilizers. And in the case of sub-Saharan Africa, this percentage is even as high as 60%. So this is a double burden for these countries with higher expenditures on both food and agricultural inputs. Now, what it is not told in relationship with the food crisis is that we are also facing a crisis of countries defaulting on their debts. In 2021, Argentina, Belize, Ecuador, Suriname, and Zambia defaulted. And last month, Sri Lanka joined them, and El Salvador, Tunisia, and Ghana are close to defaulting. Lebanon, Turkey, and Ukraine are also mentioned. So globally, we are speaking about 54 countries which are in debt crisis, meaning that the debt payments are forcing governments to implement austerity policies in order to serve the debt. So this heavily undermines social security systems as the one I mentioned before as one of the key ingredients of anti-hunger policies, labor policies, and so on and so forth, support for agroecological produced food and all of that. So there is no fiscal space for governments to protect basic economic and social rights of their citizens. So we should assume that poor countries will be facing a continuum of food price inflation, climate shocks for the years to come. So simply extending credit lines, and this is the main policy recipe that we see coming from the World Bank, the G7, and so on, that simply extending credit lines will have really very little impact on the crisis. They will be back in the same position next year or the year after, and having to weigh up debt repayment versus social spending or versus investment in the transition from industrial food systems to agroecological ones. So in that context, debt relief, debt cancellation is a must. And especially African governments have been on the forefront of demanding this, that cancellation. But the problem is that the countries holding the debts, including, for instance, BlackRock is the main debtor of Zambia, for instance, don't want to do that. And there is no multilateral system in place which is able to address that demand.
That's desperately frustrating. And I'm actually just a quick sort of follow-up, Sofía. I mean, do you see any light at the end of the tunnel here? I mean, are there any governments that seem to be doing the right thing when it seems like the preponderance of governments is, very much sticking to the status quo of sticking with high levels of indebtedness and merely providing a certain amount of, sprinklings of aid rather than addressing the debt complex in the first place?
Well, I think I see a very vibrant anti-debt movement. I think the pressure that they are exercising has sustained over the years. And I see also very interesting signals coming from, you know that the G7 meeting is taking place here in Germany this weekend. The African governments are exercising really pressure, and they are really putting the EU under pressure that the recipes to solve this crisis are completely failed. So there may be really negotiations around the debt issue. And therefore, we have to continue this convergence of movements. The food movement has to really join hands with the movement for financial justice, for economy justice, and debt cancellation, I think, has to be at the top of our agenda.
It's great to hear that African states are taking the lead there. And Mamadou, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that. I mean, it's clear that regionally there are some fairly grave problems for access to food. And I'm wondering if you can share what some of the options are to be able to think about the options in West Africa to be managing this crisis that are not perhaps on the table at the moment.
Yeah, I think actually there are different options that we need to explore. First one, I think that there is a need to explore the first defense stock that exists at farmers level. This is the first thing that needs to be done. And we are now assessing the farmers organization what exists, and then to show that there is more speculation in terms of perception of scarcity than that is reality in the ground. Secondly, countries now are exploring their national stocks, because you have national stocks in different West African countries, because there were 9 countries in the past who had their national
We've lost you there, Mamadou. See if we can get him back. Otherwise, we'll come back to you. Drat. I'm told that Mamadou's connection has dropped for now. Mamadou, we'll come back to you if you can hear us. But this, I mean, you know, the fact that there is, I mean, I'm struck by the fact that there are a range of solutions that are on the table, and they're not getting reported on. You know, we're very pleased to have some friends from the New York Times join us today. But it's very interesting to see in the New York Times editorial on this issue, you know, a sort of a hymn to American leadership that America should, you know, lead the charge to saving the world from hunger, when many of the institutions that are driving the debt crisis and opposing the kinds of solutions that Mamadou is in the middle of telling us about, and which Sofía has presented, are in fact American institutions, whether it's led by David Malpass at the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund or just the United States Agency for International Development. So you know, we're being stitched into industrial agricultural system that is very much business as usual, that depends on chemical, industrial, agriculture. Ricardo, you've been thinking about this at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And you know, the long-term trajectory for us here looks fairly bleak. What happens to our food systems if energy and the fertilizer prices for the model of industrial agriculture that the US is very keen to champion? What happens when, as those prices continue to rise? I mean, at what point do energy prices force a change in our food system? I mean, you know, we've got farmers in Iowa who are wedded to this sort of industrial food system. Is it even possible for them to cut their dependency on these fertilizers?
Yeah, I want to stick to the very concrete question that you asked. And so it's important to clarify that we can't generalize statements about industrial farmers and farmers in Iowa to all farmers. You know, that there are different farming systems throughout the world that operate in different ways. But coming back to the topic at hand, we are talking about industrial producers of large volumes of industrial commodities that are traded around the world as basically financial pieces. And in that context, farmers in general don't have a whole lot to say. They don't have a whole lot of power either as individuals or as a class. And that may sound surprising, but in fact, where that power resides is in two sectors that we can broadly call agribusiness. They're divided into the sectors that sell inputs to farmers to stoke their productivity, and then into the sectors that buy from farmers and then process and distribute what is generated from that activity. So that may seem very elementary, but it's important to establish that to then answer your question. As prices continue to increase, an ideal situation would be that it would force farmers to adopt methods that are not as dependent on fossil fuels, because fossil fuels show up not only in the obvious way as the way to propel farm machinery, but actually the highest energy expenditure on any industrial farm is for fertilizers, which are very energy intensive, particularly nitrogen-based fertilizers that require a large amount of energy that is produced by essentially a byproduct of oil exploration. And so the logical thing would be to assume that can only occur to a certain degree, and then farmers will look for alternatives that don't require as much fertilizer and don't require as much energy for fuel. In fact, there's a lot that is known about how to farm under those particular constraints, but it is easiest, it requires less skill to farm with the industrial methods, where the intelligence is actually in those two sectors that I mentioned and not so much in farming. The farmers take the risk of making those purchases, and then, you know, the weather basically is the variable that they're risking it all on. And so the direct answer to your question is, I don't think that logic is going to apply unless we get to really existential crisis levels. I can editorialize on that, but what I can actually foresee is that the usual model explored first in the United States and the EU, when things go dire for the agribusiness sectors that are really the profit centers in this entire global trade scheme, they will externalize their risk and their cost to the public sector. And so the public sector will increase their subsidy to stabilize these systems. And in Q&A, if people are interested in digging more into how that works, we can do that. But that's my initial generalized response.
Well, actually, again, a quick follow-up, just because we're having a couple of questions already around the policy options around this. I mean, you've outlined so beautifully how it is that we're locked in to certain ways of farming and ways of doing things. But then I wonder if you could take us out and just give us a sense of what are the best policy options available for governments to tackle the inflation that's happening in food and agricultural inputs. So this is a question not just about the fossil fuel in agriculture question, but Shambu Gatak, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, was asking, what are the policy options now that we find ourselves in a moment of high food price inflation, to be able to to be able to manage that and to be able to manage the inflation that's happening in agricultural inputs.
Yeah. So there are two answers depending on whether we're dealing with the emergency mode or whether we're actually dealing with long-term restructuring of the way that the system works. If there's one recurrent theme in all of the questions and answers so far, it is that the crisis that we're experiencing right now is a crisis of financial access. And so ultimately, the way that food security can be assured is to make sure that, as Sofía and others have stated, all of us have dignified livelihood, dignified income, so that we can afford to pay the real price of food, which no one is paying right now. And so if we were expected to pay the real price of food, which various estimates tell us is at least 3 times what we are currently paying, then that means that our incomes need to be able to cover that. So in the emergency situation, however, what we need to do is to make sure that supplies to the really vulnerable parts of the world are assured by the agencies that specialize in emergency redistribution of food. But that is no long term to assure food security. And by the way, this is a very elemental thing. I just want to make sure that, because this is an educational activity, but when we use that term, we're really conscious of what we're appealing to. Most of us conflate that term with food sufficiency, the notion that we produce enough food and then if there's excess, we export as nations or as regions. You can be food secure without food sufficiency if you have sufficient cash to operate in the global financial system. And a very good example of that would be the nation of Switzerland, where hunger rates are very low. This is a country that obviously is not food sufficient. It does not produce all of the food that is required to meet its internal demand, but it has food security because of the fact that it is a wealthy country and therefore its citizens are able to buy whatever they wish and whatever amounts they want. And so you can see all the permutations of that under different circumstances in different parts of the world. So in parts of the world that currently do not have either food sufficiency or food security, we have crisis. And so it is the income distribution in those countries that actually needs to be addressed. The agricultural issue is important, but it actually becomes second and third concern under those circumstances.
We're joined now again by Mamadou. Mamadou, it's good to have you back. Having heard Ricardo talk about the sort of macro issues around the food system and thinking about income and the restructuring of the food system, I'm wondering if again you might be able to give us the perspective from West Africa, particularly given the challenges posed by climate change.
Thank you. I know, that there is a lot that farmers are doing just to adapt to this climate change debate issues. There are different options that we don't have any choice. We have to go to the agroecological perspectives on our food production system, because there are so many options that are offered just to adapt the production system to the reality of climate change actually. And this is the reason why countries like Mali, even though it's a Sahel country first, very affected by drought and even some security issues, the production is, we are self-sufficient in the main cereal production actually. So Mali needs about 3.6 million tons of cereal, but we are producing between 6 million and 7 million tons of cereals because we have been also resisting to the green revolution model. So we are not too depending in reality to fertilizers, to chemical fertilizers, mainly for cotton production. This is where people are using it. So actually, there is a need to reorganize, all this production system, less depending on fertilizers, depend also on the way that we are just looking at things. Actually, many countries in West Africa are just trying to advise farmers to go for organic fertilizers production. So there is a lot of energy that people are putting actually. So it's an opportunity just to boost the organic fertilizer production and biofertilizers, biopesticide production also in the region. Secondly, we need to rebuild our food reserve in West Africa, because there is room for us just to organize the market. So this should be based on the food sovereignty perspective, buying food in the region and conserving this food in the regional stocks that exist in different countries, different places, and using it for the regional regulation models that we need to put aside. So this means that there is a need also to revamp our territorial markets, because there is actually we just realized that only via this territorial market that we can make trade on the food products, and at the same time not only create jobs, allow farmers to redistribute this wealth among at the local level, but also to push them to go in agroecological models that are more redistributive of resources in the country. Because we have an external system of our economy actually that is based on this high level of importation of fertilizers in some countries like Cote d'Ivoire, but also Benin and to some extent Togo. But actually there is room also even for the fertilizer market to organize things internally, because Nigeria has a free industry that are producing also fertilizers in the region, and there is room also for many countries to produce those things that are more nocive for our production system than others. This is the phosphate of TLMC in Mali, but also some countries like Senegal are able to just to produce more on the organic fertilizer production. So that is actually subsidized also at the same level in the region. For the first time, many countries are now subsidizing also internally the organic production system of fertilizers in the country. So food reserve at regional level, the food reserve at national level, I'm sure that optionally we can face all this climate change debate in using the agroecological perspective and then emphasizing on territorial market and allowing our food reserve to be more operational than they are actually. And that will avoid the crisis that we are facing actually in the price issues at global level.
Thank you so much, Mamadou. I mean, I think for journalists in the room who are, excuse me, used to hearing the sort of stories of disaster from sub-Saharan Africa, it's really important to remember that this idea of territorial markets, of local sustainable agroecological production isn't just some sort of hippie pipe dream from California. It is being enacted on the ground, and it needs coverage. It certainly needs financial support, and it's not. That's certainly not happening. One of the sort of factoids that illustrates the situation and the depth of the misreporting and misalignment of resources around global hunger situation is that there was a call for $16 billion for donor support for the Ukraine crisis, but only and that was filled in a month, but only 2% of the 4.4 billion that the UN needs to tackle food insecurity and hunger in the Horn of Africa has been funded to date. And while international priorities skew us away from understanding Africa in terms that farmers on the ground understand it, this is an opportunity to reimagine and recalibrate the stories that are being told about the global hunger crisis. And so maybe for the final question, we'll get back to you, Tin. I wonder what lessons you might be able to share to journalists who are writing about the food crisis today and in the future. What's missing from the bulk of reporting on the crisis that you've seen? And just before you answer that, I do want to invite the journalists who are with us today to please keep adding your questions to the chat. We've got plenty to go through, but if you've got one that you've got in mind, do stick it in there and we'll try and get to it if we can. But last word over to you, Tin.
Thanks, Raj. Look, I'm so glad that journalists, so many journalists are now interested in covering this issue, because I think it is so important. And we take food for granted and we think it's easy. But like, all the experts have just explained, including yourself, there are lots of important distinctions that I think journalists need to remember. I just have 6 quick points. One, as journalists, we like numbers because they sometimes illustrate things better than words can. But I think we really need to understand the context where these numbers are coming from so we can provide a fuller picture in our stories. Example, in point, the whole thing with the export that I talked about. Number 2, it's really important also to understand the difference between chronic and acute hunger and all the different reports from aid agencies and the United Nations, right? Because there's so many figures and numbers flying around. Some reports are about people not having enough food for a prolonged period of time. That's chronic hunger, and that can lead to malnutrition, which could again have consequences, intergenerational consequences, right, that affect not just households but countries and economies. And then there are reports that look at acute hunger, which is much more immediate. And we're talking about people on the verge of starvation. Number 3, don't just take arguments about we need to produce more food at all costs. Don't take those arguments at face value, because that is availability is not yet an issue. With climate change, it might become one. And then we could be looking at a double whammy, right? Because both quantity and quality of food could be expected. Number 4, at the moment, what we're seeing is a food price crisis. All of you have emphasized that, right? And prices are created by people and systems, right? Speculation is possibly one reason why prices have gone up, but we should also be looking at, hey, are grain companies and agri-food companies, are they making a lot of profits? And is it are they just raising prices in line with inflation, or are they taking advantage of the situation? We've seen relatively little coverage of this issue, and I think we really need to look at who is profiting in this situation. 5, often a lot of the discussions around livestock lack nuances. There's a massive imbalance in terms of consumption levels when it comes to meat, and we can't assume that everybody eats the same amount. I think we really need to make sure that there's a difference between global north and south. 6, food systems. That's not just agriculture, but essentially, from the way we grow food to transportation, processing, consumption, and waste. Food systems account for 1/3 of man-made greenhouse gas emissions. That is a lot. So if any of your, any agencies, any companies, any government coming up with plans to reduce emissions that do not include food systems, they're not going to work. They're bound to fail. So journalists need to keep pushing about how are we going to be reducing emissions from food systems. There's a major debate going on about the transformation of our food systems, and it is an extremely excited and important place to be in for a journalist. And I really hope more journalists will cover this. That's it from me. Back to you.
Tin, those were fantastic points, and I'm very excited that we've got about 35 minutes to dive in to a little bit more around the questions that have been raised, and perhaps let's just dive right in. We've got a question from Caroline Kristen, and I'm going to shove this one to you, Ricardo. The question's about meat consumption. And the question is, could you comment on the connection between the current crisis and high levels of meat and dairy consumption in the global north in particular? And if there are connections here, how can those connections be made more clear?
Yeah, well, the model for meat production in the global north is very resource intensive, and it essentially is an example that is counter to all of the arguments for the role that livestock might play in a sustainable agroecological system. So let me review that so that we have the template to compare it to. So in an agroecological system, you want to depend as little as possible on external resources and maximize the internal resources of the agricultural system. The water, the soil fertility, the nutrients can be regenerated, and so on. And in that model, it is necessary to have organisms that can help you transform organic matter and turn it into nutrients. And so livestock can play that role. But the key argument for the value and the role of livestock in an agroecological system also has to do with the fact that they can convert forage material and roughage that is not directly consumable by human beings into human food. And so that means that in areas where you have very limiting biologic production, or where the native vegetation is roughage, livestock can play this very important dual role. So they're helping to recycle nutrients, and simultaneously they're producing human food out of stuff that is not edible directly by humans. Now compare that, use that as a template, compare that to what happens in industrial food systems. It essentially is nothing of the kind. Essentially, we're taking products that could very easily be human food, produced in very expensive, very intensive ways, and making them the food for livestock that are, first of all, not on the land. And so therefore, they're not fulfilling one of the functions that I just listed, which is turning material that we would otherwise not be able to eat into food. And then secondly, because we produce them under highly concentrated situations for the purpose of industrial efficiency, then that means that the manure that they generate, which otherwise in a more distributed system could help regenerate nutrients and minimize dependence on fertilizer, now becomes a serious problem in the sense that it is an environmental hazard. So all of this comes at the price of very intensive use of everything that goes into producing the feed that those livestock consume. So it is corn, it is soy, it is wheat, it is sunflower. The rations are composed of those grains that are produced very extensively. It requires a large amount of land to produce the volumes of those commodity grains that go into sustaining the herds of millions of these livestock, pork, beef, poultry, and so on that are produced under these models in the industrial north. And so if you translated that into the food value, you would require far less production in order to be able to feed the human population, and therefore much less land if we were not utilizing that particular model. Less dependence on water, less dependence on fertilizers, and less need for total land under cultivation. So in essence, the answer to your question is that the modern model for producing so-called efficient industrial livestock is a model by which we take plenty and we turn it into scarcity.
Thank you, Ricardo. The next question, actually, I'm just going to use my my rights to jump in here. The question is around where the food crisis is hitting hardest, and I mean, again, this is a food price crisis, and since we distribute food on the basis of the ability to pay, it's going to hit hardest in general where people have no alternatives in terms of being able to grow their own food for subsistence, and instead are dependent on having money in order to be able to buy food. And so we're looking at parts of the world where incomes are low, where there's less support from the government to be able to provide income for folk. And that means that areas that currently are on the very, very precipice of widespread hunger are generally across sub-Saharan Africa in the belt that I showed a little early on, where conflict and harvest failure associated with climate change have meant that governments are unstable, that there are large populations of people migrating to avoid conflict. And those are the areas in the first instance where we're already seeing grave levels of crisis, where the international community is doing far less than it ought to be able to address that problem. But a way of thinking about where hunger hits is really just to think about power, to think about the inequities in any given society of who it is that has money versus who it is that doesn't. So even in the United States, we certainly don't have the levels of undernourishment that you see in sub-Saharan Africa, but we do have food insecurity. And if you look in the United States at who it is that's most likely to be food insecure, it's female-headed households. Women in general are more likely to be food insecure than men. And it is essentially what one does to be able to find out who it is that's most likely to go hungry. You look at who who it is that has the least income, the least access to be able to provide their own food or grow their own food, who are displaced and who are in general forced to live from hand to mouth. And that's and you can find significant pockets of that kind of hunger, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, but you can find it in India, for instance, although the data here are politicized, and actually finding the right hunger data is itself something that is a bit of a challenge for journalists. And that I'm sure that we can have another call just to deal with the sort of misrepresentations of data in the international community. But suffice to say, if you're looking at the first instance, then the World Food Programme's hunger map will give you the sort of heat spots of where hunger is acute right now. But it is all to do with the confluence of the letters C. You know, it is about conflict, about COVID, about climate change, and it's the situations, particularly in that belt of conflict, and particularly in the Horn of Africa, are hotspots for this. But it's happening. You know, you can find undernourishment, sadly, in a number of countries. And again, the World Food Programme heat map's a good place to look at that. Now, we've got a question here for Sofía. Sofía, considering food sufficiency and food security, how are farmers enabled or hampered in actually addressing the issue of food security? What do farmers need in order to be able to contribute to the addressing of food security? And that question's from Rubina Friedberg.
Yes, well, I think farming is highly differentiated alongside class. So I think that we are speaking here about peasant farming, the farming that Mamadou was describing for West Africa. And we have to talk about them because they are the ones actually feeding us. The problem is that, and this is a problem of coverage and media, that this is invisible. So we have this idea that we are fed by corporations. They are trying to do that. They are trying to increase that. They work hard with all the advertisement and so on and so forth to change our diets, to get us completely dependent on ultra processed foods and so on and so forth. But the fact is that in countries like Mali, in Brazil, it is actually peasant farming, those feeding people, and especially when it comes to vegetables, fruits, you know, fresh foods, wild fruits, which are very, very important for health. It is these populations, indigenous peoples, you know, traditional communities, and so on and so forth. So the question is, what they need? Well, first and foremost, they need to keep their lands and eventually to control more land, because one also of the facts which is not told by media is that land is highly concentrated worldwide. So peasant farmers are controlling, according to some estimations, only about 12% or 15% of the agricultural areas. So this is, and the rest is controlled by agribusiness. So this is, I think, the most important thing. I want land and water, of course. After that, I think I would say they have to, their peasant seed systems have to be protected, their own seeds, you know, the right to their own seeds, and be protected against biopiracy and intellectual property rights and UPOV and all these things which are also trying to displace peasant seed systems, which are extremely important. And then I think there is a very important investment in public systems and services, you know, roads, you know, some types of credit, so that agricultural production, agroecological production can flourish. So therefore, I think I would summarize the things that peasant farming needs in those things. Thank you.
Thank you, Sofía. And, you know, I mean, it is striking that, you know, the power of agribusiness and the vast sort of concentration of landholding is not something that one hears about. I mean, occasionally one will hear that the largest owner of, you know, the largest single owner of farmland in the United States is, of course, Bill Gates. But that's, you know, a factoid, and we rarely delve deeper into that and what that might mean, perhaps because of the vast power that Bill Gates wields. And so that brings a question again from Shambugata for Tin. Is the corporate sector's presence in the media also affecting the coverage and reporting on the actual reasons behind the rise in hunger and the escalation in prices. So, is there something about the way, the structure in which reporting itself happens and the political economy of reporting that is affecting the way that we understand this food price crisis?
It's a great question, but also a very difficult question to answer. I don't want to pretend to know, how the corporate media thinks. Or, I mean, I don't even like the term, mainstream media, because we're not homogenous, right? But having said that, I mean, I think there are a few different reasons as to why the coverage perhaps is not as clear cut as it should have been. Number one, the media sector have seen massive, attrition rates, and it's been going through massive consolidation. And being a journalist these days, it's harder than ever before. So you've got journalists that are covering all sorts of different topics, and then suddenly, when something like Ukraine happened, and then food prices spike, this is not a topic that they normally cover. So they just take the numbers and the information at a face value. And that's when suddenly it creates a kind of panic about food shortages, right? But also there is definitely, I think, corporate interest in pushing a narrative around what is happening is purely, Ukraine and Russia, because then that ignores the structural problems that we have in our food systems, right? And that ignores the fact that we need to transform them. And there are issues around, like what Ricardo talked about, industrial food production. Because if we just blame Russia, as long as the war ends, everything will be okay. This is not a direct answer to your question, I'm afraid, but because I think there are just so many different reasons as to why, the topic is covered the way it is. But I think there's definitely, yes, a push from corporate interest, but I don't think that is the only reason. I think part of the thing is journalists are also still just catching up on what's going on.
Thank you, Tin. And part of that catching up is precisely about understanding what's happening on the ground. So I'm going to turn to a couple of more sort of regionally specific questions. I'm going to start with Mamadou. We've got a question from the excellent Tim Wise. Mamadou, this feels like a technical question, but it actually speaks to this sort of broader issue of the possibilities of change. Tim's wondering, how many of Mali's farmers rely on inorganic fertilizer, but behind that is the bigger question of what are the available alternatives to synthetic fertilizers, to the industrial chemistry that we talked about earlier on in the short run. I mean, what are those options to be able to farm organically in Mali or in other parts of the world?
Yeah, in Mali, the biggest part of the farmers that are using chemical fertilizers are cotton producers, because this is using between 80 to 82% of the whole import of chemical fertilizers in the country. And some are using maize, but if you look at the trends of usage of chemical fertilizer, it's a very low quantity of fertilizer that are used. This means what? That usually people will mix fertilizers in the maize farm, but usually for millet and sorghum, they are all organic production mainly in the country. So out of the 80% of the fertilizer that you use, this is about it's less than 40% of the producers, of the total farmers that are using chemical fertilizers for this. It means what? So if we import, actually Mali has about 40% of the needs of chemical fertilizers in the country. It means that production from cotton will drop very drastically. And this is it a good thing or not? But because many farmers who have been producing cotton last year are now producing millet and sorghum, because prices of these specific products have been going up, but they are used for food stuff. While cotton, usually we use it for oil, but also for animal food. But beside that, we are just processing 0.8% of the cotton is processed in the country. So it goes to international market as raw material and it's processed there. So Mali is losing a lot of money, just borrowing money for production and that importing fertilizers and then producing cotton. So it's a good trend actually that the government is advising farmers to go for more organic fertilizer. And now the objective for this year is to use 70% of the production need of our fertilizers as organic production. It's possible because we have actually some two channels of production. The first one is the farmers' production system themselves, and the second one is that there are some industries that are local that are now trying to produce at a large scale level, and subsidies that was 30% of the price of the organic production fertilizer last year has become now 50%. And then the biggest part of the subsidies for farmers is actually on organic production. So these companies that exist, that are owned by Malians, the biggest part of them, there is one that is transborder, also using Senegal, Burkina Faso, and Niger. But the rest now are providing the biggest share of the input market actually in Mali. So it means that we can go up and more than what you are producing. Just to give you an example, I have an organic farm myself, and then I was producing. I had an aiming to produce 5 tons of organic fertilizers actually, but I produce 32 tons of organic fertilizer. That is beyond even my need, but I'm using only local product just to do it. So it's possible just to go beyond the capacity, and this is what is happening actually. And it's becoming also cities like Selenge, when I'm staying actually, where there is the farmers training center, Nyeleni, and now the streets are well cleaned because everybody has been jumping on the street, on the dust or the trash bins that exist just to collect everything that can be transformed and then using them. So it's really a way of this situation has been a way for Mali just to revert the situation of organic fertilizers production, and I'm sure that we can do more than what is going on actually in the country. So we can scale up the production in the region, in West Africa and globally, because Cote d'Ivoire is the exception of it, and Nigeria. Beside these two countries, I know that all these other countries can reverse the situation like Mali is trying to do it now with Senegal too.
Thank you, Mamadou. That idea that there can be this kind of locally supported transformation begs the question: well, what can government do here? And in order to bridge us into the big the big questions that we're going to end with, Sofía, I'm wondering if you might be able to give us an insight into this world of possibility, particularly given the election in Colombia. And I'm wondering if you can just give us sort of your take on what the recent election in Colombia might augur, and particularly the election of Vice President Francia Márquez might have on food issues, given her strong advocacy of agroecology and food sovereignty.
Yes, thank you, Raj. So I'm Colombian, so I'm delighted to be able to answer that question. So as you know, it's a historic moment for us. It's extremely moving. You cannot imagine how important it is, because it's overcoming our trauma for generations that we cannot have a leftist government. So Francia Márquez is an important social leader. So it's not that much that she's in power, but it is entire movements who are in power. Remember 1 year ago, we had a massive unrest of protest, against the plight of hunger. Hunger was very much at the center. And it is this youth in cities like Cali, Bogota, many places in Colombia, it is this youth who has elected that government. So therefore, we are speaking here about people's power. So people's power is there. It's not going to be easy. Half of Colombians are extremely hostile to that government. But the important thing is that this government is thinking big in alliances in the region with the government of Chile. We very much hope, of course, that Brazil will also change its government. And then for sure, we hope that this Latin American pole will become a driving force of doing the right things that we need in food. And I think probably the most important thing is that Francia Márquez can bridge and build a strong alliance between Latin Americans and Africans. I think that would be what we need in order to really put many of these solutions on the table.
Thank you. A note of hope there. And we can't have hope without pouring cold water on it, because we've got a few questions about the structure of the international food system and international trade. And I'm wondering if actually Sonia Chervana has a question about high subsidies. And that feeds into a question from Jitendra on the World Trade Organization. I'm wondering, Sofía or Ricardo, whether you might want to take this. So the question is, how does the World Trade Organization's food policy play a role in extending global hunger? Surely keeping the agriculture out of the World Trade Organization would be the wiser thing to do, and particularly since India has recently been fairly obstreperous about its capacity to be able to engage in subsidies of farmers against WTO rules. I'm wondering, actually, maybe this is for Sofía again. Can you give us a sense of how it is that the World Trade Organization is implicated in the country's inability to be able to provide subsidies for consumers and or subsidies for farmers?
Well, Raj, the problem is I'm not an expert on trade. I don't know whether Ricardo wants to take it. Well, the only thing I want to say is that the food reserves discussion is being on hold since years because WTO. Do you remember that India was fighting for the public stock holding system? Mamadou said, what we need now is to build reserves at local level, at national level, at regional level, and at global level. And this discussion has been impossible because WTO. So this is a clear problem with that, but that's all what I can say. Perhaps Ricardo can add.
Yeah, well, just at a very high level, the issue is that the worldview of everything that is discussed at organizations such as the WTO is a very orthodox interpretation of economics, which we actually don't see in the real world. So let me give you an example. I mean, this is just basic economics. The basic premise of the rules that they write there is that if we all trade among ourselves for the things that we are specialized to do best in our own corners of the world, we're all better off. The facts on the ground are that in the food system, we have therefore massive market breakdown. Because if you're not willing to accept the statement that on just raw observation, the more profit agribusiness makes, that is the entire economic sector that buys, processes, and distributes food across the world, the system we've been discussing here, the more profit they make, the sicker we all get. If you're not willing to accept that, then at the very least, we all do need to accept that that system does not see a significant swathe of the global population. But that does not matter to WTO. To WTO, what matters is that these folks are essentially self-dealing, writing rules for themselves that facilitate a global shell game around ostensive supply and demand of commodities and manufactured products. So essentially, the rules will favor the system that has failed under present circumstances. In other words, the failure is the fact that it is completely blind to certain sectors of humanity that are not able to command effective demand in this global system. So that means that we must work outside of the entire WTO structure if we want to address root causes of food security in different corners of the planet. Particularly if you look at what I'll just, without any compunction, call the justice aspects of it. This is not commonly a topic among economists. But I've noticed a lot of questions about fertilizers, and I'll just point out something that I think all of you know, and hopefully maybe we're just connecting some dots here. The massive productivity of industrial systems has to do with the fact that they are subsidized, not in the sense that you're thinking of when you hear that word. You're thinking about the financial subsidy that stabilizes those systems. I'm talking about actual biological subsidization. So that massive productivity would not be possible without mobilizing large amounts of nutrients from around the world and concentrating them in the staging areas that we call the world's breadbasket. And for just one vivid example, one of the key sources of phosphorus, one of the 3 macronutrients required for massive industrial production, is actually Western Africa. And yet when we speak about Western Africa and the global food system, we're talking about the disruptions and apparent dysfunctions that we're talking about right now. We talk about Western Africa and much of Africa in general as essentially a case of a failed system, when in fact, what we have is appropriation of resources for their maximization, both economic and ecological, in other parts of the world. Is a totally consumptive and extractive model, which the WTO rules will help to support.
You said it better than I ever could, but I'm still going to speak because I mean, I think what's often forgotten is that the World Trade Organization, while it pretends to be an organization that's about the level playing field in agriculture, in fact, the initiation of the World Trade Organization was precisely about a mechanism through which the United States and the European Union were able to keep their supports for farmers in place, whereas the rest of the world had theirs kicked away. And the World Trade Organization operates in concert with the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and donor agencies in order precisely to make that, to provide that process of extraction and to make it easier for the long supply chains that have characterized the global food system really since its inception to function. And this is a way of answering a question from Francesco Pagnier, which was around one of the explanations, so one of the reasons we are being given for the increase in food prices is because after COVID, international supply chains couldn't react fast enough to the to demand, and the question was, well, is that true? To some extent, of course, when COVID first broke, we saw how long supply chains were not up to task, were not able to feed the world in the ways that they had so often trumpeted. Now, what we have is a situation in which those long supply chains are essentially vectors of transmission of pain. And so now what we have is a story of how the international markets are ways of transmitting discomfort in one area or a crisis in one area and really vectoring it straight into the most vulnerable populations. So yes, the international supply chains have been sticky. And the reason that they are always so tight and they're always ready to snap is because they are just-in-time production mechanisms. And when there are other disruptions to that just-in-time possibility, whether it's climate change or workers demanding a living wage, or disruptions in terms of financial speculation or what have you, those supply chains are always vulnerable. So in that process, the supply chains are, these long supply chains have always been a problem. The international food system is characterized by long histories of supply chains. Back in the day, supply chains were just colonialism. And the international tight supply chains that we have now are uniquely vulnerable, and they are made possible precisely through the World Trade Organization and a range of other institutions. And unfortunately, it does look like they're going to continue to transmit vulnerability unless we have some sort of transformation in the food system. And that's the question I want to end on. Really for Mamadou, I mean, if we imagine a better food system and better good practices, what good practices can you see and recommend in countries, particularly countries that have been dealing with political instability? I wonder if Mamadou, or indeed Sofía, if you want to jump in on this, we can end on a note of some sort of hope.
I think that for the food system, I've already mentioned it. So there is a need to clarify the way that we are producing, but also to organize the other segment of the food system. This is the conservation, but also processing at local level. But there are so many women involved in the processing segment of production and also organizing the market. So first is agroecological perspective. So this is really very instrumental to stabilizing not only the production system, to link it to the food system, because people are producing more product in some regions of Mali or Cote d'Ivoire with coffee and cocoa. Look at also Nigeria, what is going on actually in the livestock for external production, for export, instead of just feeding the population. So the linkages between the food system, the production system, and the food system is very critical. So this is agroecological person that can provide that. Secondly, then to this triangle, then the market, that is territorial market, being the key segment, just to allow those who are not producing to access to this food. and at the same time distributing resources at the local level, but also national level, and even sometimes at the cross-border level is very critical for the model that we need to highlight. So actually, there is a strong commitment from different governments in West African countries just to go for agroecological perspective. Senegal has a very political commitment with the president in his program. The case of Mali, because food sovereignty is our guidelines in the production system. Now we have a platform involving even ministries of agriculture and ministry of livestock on the in this platform just to work on what we call the agroecological transition in Mali. And so trying to highlight the key steps and what should be done, and even transiting from even cotton production to organic cotton production has been debating in the country. This is why the cotton company have been sending to Farmers Training Center 400 producers of cotton producers to learn how to produce organic fertilizer. So this is a new trend and a key step just to move forward. So actually, the best way I think is just to implement what has been decided at regional level, because in West Africa we have what we call the agroecological transition program for West Africa. That is a big program supporting our countries now just to work on that. So we need to really implement such programs, such initiatives, so that agroecology can be the line that will go through and connecting the food production system to the market system and the food consumption system in
Thank you. Thank you, Mamadou. We've got just 3 minutes left, and such an important question from Le Monde about the G7. We've got the G7 summit coming up, and I'm wondering, and the question from Mathilde Gerard is, what can we expect from the G7 summit, and what other initiatives, international initiatives, can we turn to or expect something from in dealing with this crisis? I'm going to throw it very quickly to Sofía and then to Tin.
Yes, thank you, Raj. Well, we don't think the G7 is legitimate to take these decisions. Sorry, but this is a club of rich countries. And I made my points at the beginning that this is about democracy. This is about people's agency. So therefore, we need to take these decisions in the multilateral spaces. We have the UN Committee on World Food Security, where peasant farmers can take the lead. So that's what I want to say. And we see a lot of smokescreen action with all these coalitions, and voluntary commitments, and yet another initiative, and so on and so forth. No, we need binding rules, and we need really serious commitments.
Thank you, Sofía. Tin, last word to you.
Yeah, just very briefly, right? I mean, I don't know what's going to come out of the G7 summit, but really we need to ask, if they're going to launch another coalition or another initiative, why do we need another one? We already have so many. Ask, what is this going to be doing now that has not been done or has failed before? Number one. Number two, if all they're going to say is we need to produce more food, please push back, because that is not what we need right now. And number three, like Sofía said, all the smokescreen. Just last year, we had the Food System Summit. There was so much fanfare, and there was so much, money announced, and initiatives, new coalitions. We need to go back and ask, what have they achieved? Why is G7 doing this? What is it really going to be doing? I think we need to be asking them really difficult questions, and not just let them get away with saying, oh, we're going to save the world and we're going to feed everybody.
Thank you so much, Tin. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd particularly like to thank Ricardo, Sofía, Tin, and Mamadou, and the teams at IPES Food and at A Growing Culture. If you enjoyed this, sign up to A Growing Culture's press forum on August the 2nd, where Indigenous and peasant groups will be sharing food system solutions. These recordings will be available in English, French, and Spanish, and they'll be uploaded to YouTube shortly. Thank you all for joining us. We'll officially close off here. Thanks very much.